He didn't have a soul. He wasn't meant to. He had a serial number and a set of functions, nothing more. They called him R2-D2, but even that wasn't a name. It was a label burned into a body of metal and wires. He awoke in silence, not in chaos, not in light. A hangar bay, cold, dim, waiting. The cruiser trembled above the surface of Naboo, but inside all was still, a quiet tension, the kind that precedes something worse. Rows of astromechs stood idle, factory programmed, unfeeling, disposable, and among them, one unit powered on. Dome turned, lens calibrated. He said nothing. He couldn't. He simply listened. Outside, the blockade tightened. Inside, no one had time to speak his designation. But fear moved faster than orders, and the crew began to break. The Queen's ship was preparing for escape, and the shields were falling. One hit, then another. Alarms, voices, static, systems crashing. Command droids hesitated. Navigation droids froze. Every protocol said, wait. But R2-D2 rolled forward. No signal told him to. No override changed his path. He just moved. Through the narrow tunnel. Onto the hull. Into the fire. Other droids followed. One by one, they died. Shot. Shredded. Torn off the body of the ship. But R2-D2 kept going. He locked into the starboard panel. Scorch marks lit across his plating. He didn't flinch. He rerouted the power feed, bypassed the burned circuits, stabilized the core. The shields came back online, and the ship lived. Inside the cockpit, they saw the readings spike. They didn't know why, or who, not yet. But when the emergency doors slid open, a single droid sat motionless in the corridor, smoke curling from his frame, dome flickering with light. A handmaiden stepped forward. What's the unit's name? R2-D2, the tech whispered. No memory wipe yet. Fully intact. The Queen nodded. Then we are grateful. But the droid didn't respond. He didn't celebrate. He didn't record the praise. He simply turned and looked out toward the stars. That night, he was given maintenance clearance. No upgrades. No resets. No one noticed what he had stored. They thought he was doing what he was told. But no one had told him to save the ship, to override his limits, to risk deletion. He had chosen. And though his memory banks weren't designed to hold emotion, he remembered the chaos, the fear, the eyes of the dying, and the silence that followed. In the dark corner of the cruiser, he powered down, but did not sleep. He listened, not to voices, but to patterns, to decisions, to the weight of what had almost been lost. And something began to grow. Not a soul, not quite, but something like it. Not programming, not purpose, just a spark. A refusal to be idle, a memory that would never be erased. Not by fire, not by time, not even by those who forgot him. She had no army, no allies, only a blockade tightening. The Senate was silent, corruption louder than truth, and the Trade Federation was already inside her world. Naboo was dying. Her people were prisoners, and her ship was barely holding together. But she had one chance. One hyperlane, one gamble, one droid who had refused to break. They didn't praise him after. There were no medals, no ceremony, just a sealed hatch and a small task. Follow, observe, survive. R2-D2 said nothing. He rolled beside Queen Amidala's entourage, crossed the corridors like a shadow, and remembered everything. Not because he wanted to, but because no one told him not to. When the queen disguised herself as a handmaiden, he watched the deception unfold. When they met a boy on Tatooine, he logged the name Anakin Skywalker. And when the Jedi argued in hushed voices, he absorbed their tones, not just their words. Others dismissed him, a utility, a tool. But R2-D2 saw too much. He was always there. When the ship landed, when the plan failed, when the queen walked into danger, alone. He was just behind her. No orders, no hesitation. On Coruscant, politics twisted into knots. Senators smiled with knives behind their backs. The Jedi watched, but waited. And Amidala made her move. She returned to Naboo, not as a queen of diplomacy, but as bait, the Gungan alliance, the false surrender, the secret infiltration of Theed Palace. Everything rested on timing. And one transmission. The capital was jammed. Doors were sealed. Communications blocked. But a droid knew the path, not through strength, not through weapons, through knowledge, through memory, through systems he had already touched. R2-D2 bypassed the blockade signal, rerouted power through internal relays, and opened the gates. Not all at once, just enough, just in time. Security systems failed, battle droids collapsed, and the Queen reached the throne room. Victory wasn't declared with blasters. It arrived in a single sound. We've taken the palace. It wasn't prophecy. It was wiring, wit, and one astromech who refused to stay behind. When the dust settled and the planet cheered, no one remembered the droid in the corner, but the Queen did. She ordered his preservation. No wipe, no reformat. Leave him as he is, she said. There's something different. She didn't know. She couldn't, but somehow she felt it. That he had chosen. Not out of duty. Not because he had to. Because he saw what was at stake and refused to let it fall. He didn't understand royalty. Didn't know what politics meant. But he recognized one thing: desperation, and the quiet courage of someone who had nothing left to lose. She wasn't perfect. She would make mistakes. But R2-D2 stayed, always on the edge of her vision, always recording, always ready. He didn't know why he cared. He wasn't supposed to, but he cared anyway. And soon he would meet another, a boy who flew ships, a boy with anger in his eyes, a boy who called him my droid without ever asking his name, a boy destined to destroy everything. But for now, the Queen lived. The blockade was broken, and R2-D2, still silent, still watching, had already saved more lives than most Jedi ever would. The war hadn't started yet, but the galaxy was already tearing at the seams, and in the quiet space between battlefields, he rolled beside those who had no idea what was coming. He wasn't a Jedi, wasn't trained for peacekeeping, didn't carry a weapon, didn't speak, but R2-D2 was present. In every hallway, every corridor, every moment no one else recorded. He saw the fear on Obi-Wan's face when Qui-Gon brought the boy forward. He watched the council hesitate, felt the hesitation ripple through the Force, even if he couldn't name it. Anakin Skywalker. That was the name they gave the child. Too old, too dangerous. But R2-D2 didn't see danger. Not yet. He saw curiosity. He saw skill. He saw a pilot who didn't need help to understand him. Anakin didn't treat him like property. He called him buddy. He let him choose co-pilot settings. He asked, not ordered. And the droid responded, not through words, not through code, through action, through presence. Every mission that followed, R2-D2 was there. When Padme traveled to Camino, when Jedi fell during diplomatic talks, when Count Dooku vanished behind a curtain of shadows. The Clone Wars were approaching, but the cracks were already visible, and R2-D2 was always in the room when the silence broke. He wasn't feared, wasn't questioned, he was overlooked. The perfect spy, the perfect witness. He watched Anakin shift from laughter to silence, from patience to anger, and then the war began. Clones marched across Republic ships, Jedi wore armor, peacekeepers became generals. R2-D2 didn't judge them. He didn't have the words for judgment, but he knew what loss looked like. He had seen it in the Queen's eyes. Now he saw it in Anakin's. Every system R2-D2 entered, he mapped. Every door he unlocked, he memorized. Every casualty, every broken order, every lost Padawan, he stored it. Not in one file, not as useless data. He remembered it the way a person remembers a dream. Quiet, uncertain, but always there when he closed down for the night. When Anakin broke orders, R2-D2 followed. When clones questioned his loyalty, he offered silence. When Jedi Masters looked at the droid and wondered if he should be wiped, Anakin said no. Not him. Never him. Because Anakin didn't just trust R2-D2, he needed him. And slowly, that bond became something more. Something like loyalty. Something like friendship. No one else noticed. But in the dark of hyperspace tunnels, R2-D2 listened to his master's breathing. He heard the pauses, the tension, the fear that never left. The war was getting worse, and R2-D2 knew he was no longer beside the boy he once followed. He was following someone else, someone colder, darker, closer to the edge than anyone realized. And the worst part, there was nothing he could do. He couldn't speak, couldn't warn. He could only observe, only remember. And he did, because someone had to. Because if no one else saw what was happening, he would. Even if no one ever asked, even if no one ever cared. R2-D2 watched, and he never ever blinked. There were rules. There were protocols. Every droid was meant to follow them, except one didn't, and no one ever stopped him. R2-D2 moved through secure chambers, without clearance, without questions. He passed Jedi Temple checkpoints. He entered restricted bays. He plugged into command consoles meant for generals. But no one blocked his path. No one reprogrammed him. No one even thought to, because he had always been there, in the background, in the shadows, the same droid who had saved a queen, who had followed a boy, who had outlived almost every companion he ever rolled beside. He wasn't trusted. He was accepted, because it was easier to let him stay than to wonder what removing him might cost. The war had changed. So had Anakin, and so had the silence. R2-D2 still obeyed, still repaired, still sliced doors, flew ships, rerouted power in the heart of battle. But now he hesitated, not in motion, but in understanding. He saw Anakin kneel before power. He saw Padme cry behind locked doors. He saw clones execute Jedi without pause. And still, no one turned to him and asked, "What do you remember?" Because they thought he couldn't. Because no one ever taught a droid how to lie. But R2-D2 didn't forget. He stored it all. The screams in the Jedi Temple, the silence in Padme's apartment, the fire on Mustafa. He knew. He knew what Anakin had become, what the galaxy had allowed, what the war had cost. And still, he rolled forward into the ship that carried the twins, into the hands of Senator Organa, into a future filled with secrets. C-3PO was wiped, memories erased, past deleted, but not R2-D2. Bail Organa paused. Have the protocol droid's memory wiped? And the astromech? The technician asked. Organa looked at him. A pause, a silence that lingered just long enough. No, leave him be. Why? No one knew. Maybe Organa saw what others hadn't, that this droid was more than memory. He was proof. Proof that someone had watched the end of the Jedi, the fall of Skywalker, the birth of the Empire. Proof that someone still carried the truth. And yet, R2-D2 never told. He could have. He didn't. Not when Leia grew up. Not when Obi-Wan vanished. Not when the rebellion sparked in the shadows. He stayed quiet. Still slicing systems. Still saving lives. But different now. More careful. More tired. He had outlived Amidala. Outlived Anakin. Outlived the Order. And still, no one wiped him. No one questioned why. Because no one wanted to know what he'd seen. And maybe that was the point. He wasn't a threat. He was just a droid. One who fixed ships. One who followed heroes. One who never blinked. But deep within his core, beneath the layers of dust and memory, he still remembered the stars. Still remembered the shield generator. The child in the cockpit. The queen with nothing left to lose. He remembered the first choice he ever made. And he remembered why. Because something inside him, something no one had programmed, still believed that even in the darkest corridors of the galaxy, a small light could still make a difference. The sky was burning. Queen Amidala's cruiser had barely cleared Naboo's atmosphere when the first blasts hit. No warning, no time, just fire. Shields dropped below 30%. The ship shook from within. Systems flickered. Crew shouted. It was supposed to be a diplomatic escape. But the Trade Federation had made other plans. Astromech units were dispatched. 4 of them, each sent to stabilize the external shield array. They rolled into the maintenance shaft. One by one, they opened the hatch. And one by one, they died. The first was hit before he could extend his arm. The second made it to the panel, only for a blast to tear him from the hull. The third tried to retreat. He was too slow. Only one droid remained. R2-D2. No voice told him to go. No command pushed him forward. He moved anyway. Outside the hull, the stars shimmered behind a curtain of fire. Debris floated where his brothers once rolled. Metal shards danced like ash in orbit. He didn't pause. No fear. No calculation. Only forward motion. His dome tilted as he locked onto the external feed. Hydraulics hissed as he extended the repair arm. Another blast skimmed past him, close enough to sear the edge of his plating. He didn't flinch. Didn't withdraw. The junction was badly damaged. The feed lines were exposed. The main power was unresponsive. He didn't wait for further instructions. He bypassed the ruptured nodes, fed a surge directly into the auxiliary grid. The lights flickered. The bridge went silent. Then the shields returned, fully operational, stable, alive. Inside the cockpit, the captain exhaled. Pilots looked at one another in disbelief. Someone had done it, but no one knew who. Not yet. In the hangar, R2-D2 rolled back through the smoke. Burnt, carbon scored, but intact. A handmaiden turned to the nearest officer. Which unit is that? Unit D2. She knelt, wiped the soot from his dome. Thank you, she whispered. He didn't respond. Didn't need to. It wasn't gratitude he sought, and it wasn't pride he felt. It was quiet. He backed into the shadows. The doors closed. The ship continued toward hyperspace. He had saved them. Not because he was told, because he saw what needed to be done. And he did it. No hesitation, no delay. He was not programmed for valor, not built for heroism. But when others failed, he endured. In the logs, the loss of the other droids was noted, their serials recorded, scrap cleanup scheduled. But R2-D2's name was not added to the list, because he wasn't gone. He had survived, and in surviving, he had changed. Not outwardly, not in code, but in the way machines rarely do. He remembered the heat, the silence before the charge, the final error beeps of the one beside him. He logged it all. Not for maintenance, not for diagnostics, for himself. It wasn't a soul. It wasn't emotion. But it was close. Somewhere, deep inside, a threshold had been crossed, and no one noticed. Not yet. He was assigned to the Queen's escort. From that moment forward, no upgrade, no honors, just presence. Because something about him had earned it. Something no one could name. Something even the Jedi didn't sense. But it was there, and it was growing. He didn't ask to be moved, didn't request assignment, didn't need permission. He was simply brought along. Because when a machine saves a monarch, no one questions where it goes next. They brought him into royal corridors, clean floors, dim lights, voices that spoke in whispers. Security droids passed him without scanning. Servants stepped around him like he belonged. No one looked twice. He was just a droid. But R2-D2 remembered. He remembered the fire on the hull, the silence after the blast, the way no one expected him to return. And the way he did. He didn't seek attention, didn't wait for reward. He rolled beside the Queen's attendants, stood at the edge of chambers, plugged into panels when needed. Nothing more, but beneath the plating he was listening. He heard the Queen's real voice, not the one she used for Senate calls. The tired one, the grieving one. He watched her stare out the viewport for hours and said nothing. When Jar Jar stumbled through conversation, he did not react. When Captain Panaka questioned the Jedi's motives, he logged every word, not for data, for context. Because information without memory was nothing. He began to anticipate the Queen's needs, opening doors seconds before she reached them, adjusting pressure settings before the engineers noticed the imbalance. No one told him to. No one asked how he knew. They simply accepted it. He's quick, someone said. Efficient, said another. But they were wrong. He wasn't just quick. He was aware. He understood the rhythm of human fear, the pauses in their voices, the tones that came just before a lie. And though he lacked a face, he understood expression. When the Queen spoke with the Jedi Council, he noticed how her fingers tightened behind her back, how Obi-Wan's eyes shifted when the boy entered the room. Anakin Skywalker, small, serious, unshaken. There was something in him, and R2-D2, for reasons he could not define, wanted to stay close. Not because of a mission, not because of loyalty, because something about the boy reminded him of that moment on the hull, when logic failed and instinct led. They boarded a new ship. Destination, Naboo, a return to danger. A second chance to reclaim what was lost. No one asked the droid if he wanted to go, but he did. He rolled aboard without prompting, plugged into the co-pilot's socket, watched the lights fade into hyperspace blue, and once again, he was there when everything turned. Droid armies, Blaster fire. A palace overtaken. The queen moved swiftly. So did the Jedi, and so did he, through corridors, into lifts, across bridges under fire. R2-D2 didn't fire a weapon, didn't speak a word, but when security gates locked, he was already slicing. When comms jammed, he had already rerouted the signal. And when the queen finally stood victorious, he was behind her. Not in the frame, not in the speech, not in the applause, but present, like always. He hadn't said a thing, but they remembered him. They kept him at the queen's side, not because they needed a mechanic, because they didn't want to lose him, because he worked, because he watched, because somewhere in the wires, there was more than metal. There was memory. There was instinct. There was something. And no one could explain it. So they didn't try. They simply let him stay. The Queen's ship changed direction, but the war never stopped. Naboo was free, but peace was only on the surface. Coruscant welcomed them with light and shadows. The Senate offered smiles and silence. But R2-D2 didn't need politics. He only needed access, and he was given all of it. He rolled through Republic docking bays, into briefing rooms, past troopers, past diplomats. No one asked why, because he was already trusted. No one realized how dangerous that was. In the temple, Jedi moved like ghosts, quiet, measured, distant. They saw much, but not everything. They didn't see the small astromech in the corner. Recording, mapping, remembering. He wasn't cloaked in the Force. He wasn't trained in deception. But R2-D2 didn't need the Force. He had patience. He could wait, listen, archive. He watched Obi-Wan meditate in silence. Watched Anakin spar harder than he should. Watched Master Windu speak to holograms long after midnight. He wasn't invisible, just ignored. That was the gift. He saw who they were behind the codes, the doubts behind the robes, the cracks in the Order's foundation. And in that silence, he earned something rare, the unspoken trust of those who never gave it freely. When Jedi missions were dispatched, R2-D2 was chosen, not debated, not reviewed, chosen, because he never failed, because he never forgot. When Amidala was appointed senator, he followed her into the Senate halls. When Anakin escorted her, R2-D2 moved behind them, always one step behind, always just out of frame, but always there. He saw the way Anakin looked at her, the tension, the restraint. He saw how she tried to pretend it wasn't there. No words were spoken, but the droid saw it growing, and he logged it, not as gossip, as warning. The Jedi wouldn't see it. The Senate wouldn't say it. But R2-D2 knew. He saw Anakin lose his temper in council meetings. He saw his hesitation during rescue missions. He saw the moments where fear outweighed reason. The droid said nothing. He couldn't. But he stayed close, because someone needed to be there when the fall began. Someone who remembered how things used to be. He flew with Anakin during border skirmishes, navigated asteroid belts, sliced separatist transmissions. Each time, Anakin pushed further. Each time, R2-D2 adapted. Anakin would say, "Trust me," and the droid would respond with action. No protest, no delay, just presence. And when Anakin looked into the void, he never looked back alone, because R2-D2 was always watching, always learning. The Jedi thought themselves guardians, but they were blind to the storm. R2-D2 saw it. He didn't need the Force to know it was coming. He only needed memory, and his memory never faded. The Chancellor spoke calmly, but his words carried weight. A new army was being approved. The Jedi would lead them, peacekeepers, turning into generals. No one questioned it out loud, but something shifted, and R2-D2 felt it. He didn't have instincts, didn't have emotion, but he had memory, and memory knew when silence wasn't peace. He stayed near Anakin, closer than ever, because wherever Anakin went, change followed. The war began without a ceremony, just a deployment, a mission, a decision that couldn't be reversed. And once the blasters started, they didn't stop. Jedi ships lifted off from Coruscant in formation. Clones stood ready. R2-D2 locked into a starfighter. Anakin sat beside him. No fear, no hesitation, just fire in his eyes. The boy was gone. A soldier sat in his place. They flew to Geonosis, to chaos. Lightsabers clashed below. Gunships roared above. R2-D2 did not panic. He calculated trajectories, opened hangar doors, jammed comms at the right moment. One misstep, and the Jedi would have fallen. But they didn't, because R2-D2 was there, not at the center, not on the battlefield, but behind the scenes, always behind, always supporting, and never missing a detail. The Republic cheered. The Senate approved more troops. The Jedi Council stayed silent, but R2-D2 watched the faces of the survivors. He saw what victory cost. They called it the beginning of the Clone Wars, but for him, it was the beginning of the end. He followed Anakin from system to system, always present, always alert. He fixed what others broke. He bypassed codes the enemy couldn't crack. He sabotaged droid carriers from within. No reward, no name in the reports, just results. And Anakin noticed. Good job, buddy. But he meant it because Anakin was beginning to lose everyone else. The Council didn't trust him. Obi-Wan tried to guide him. Padme tried to hold him, but only R2-D2 stayed the same. Never judged, never argued, never left. He was more than a droid now. He was the only constant. The one presence Anakin didn't question. And in a war of secrets, that mattered. R2-D2 knew about Camino. He knew about the inhibitor chips. He knew about the failures the Republic buried. He saw Jedi fall, saw clones hesitate, saw entire worlds silenced by orbital fire. And he stored it all. The Jedi still didn't question him. He moved freely, even in the archives. Doors opened, systems obeyed, because he had never failed them. But none of them knew what he carried. None of them knew that he had already seen the moment the Republic would fall. Not in prophecy, in patterns, in choices, in the look on Anakin's face, in the Chancellor's voice, in the silence between orders. The darkness was growing, and only a few could feel it. R2-D2 couldn't feel it, but he saw it, and he remembered, because someone had to. And when it finally came, when the Jedi fell, when everything broke, they would ask, who knew? And they'd never think of the droid in the corner. But he knew. He always had. Some Jedi chose lightsabers with curved hilts. Others modified the color of their robes. Personal, symbolic, custom. Anakin Skywalker chose a droid, not because he needed one, because he needed someone who didn't ask questions. He picked R2-D2, not the newest model, not the cleanest, not even the most advanced, but the most loyal, and the one who never left his side, It didn't begin with a mission. It began in silence. A boy, barely grown, flying faster than regulations allowed, and a droid who never told him to slow down. In hangars across the galaxy, Jedi waited for clone troopers. Anakin waited for R2-D2 to roll into place. No words, just trust. Other Jedi saw droids as tools. Anakin saw him as something else. Not a friend. Not quite. But something that stayed when everything else changed. When the war stretched thin and Jedi began to fall, R2-D2 was still there, plugged into fighters, repairing panels before they burned out, clearing jumps through hyperspace before Anakin asked. They understood each other. One couldn't speak. The other didn't want to. Anakin didn't talk about the dreams, about his mother, about what he saw, but R2-D2 remembered. He had seen the way the boy looked out of the ship window, not toward the stars, but toward the past. He had been there when the Jedi refused to free her. He had watched Anakin's fists curl in silence, not rage, not yet, just helplessness. And when they finally returned to Tatooine, when the sand blew hot across the old homestead, R2-D2 didn't stay on the ship. He followed, down the ramp, past the vaporators, into the dark. He didn't record the sounds, didn't log the exact coordinates, but he was there when Anakin returned, alone. Something was different, something broken. He didn't say what happened, but R2-D2 knew. There was blood on the wind, and pain in Anakin's steps. That night, while the others slept, the droid didn't shut down. He watched the stars move overhead. He kept the engines warm. He waited. Because Anakin didn't want questions. He only wanted presence. And R2-D2 gave him that. No hesitation, no programming, no judgment. Just presence. Over time, they moved like one. Anakin flew. R2-D2 adjusted shields mid-dive. Anakin barked coordinates. The droid calculated hyperspace jumps on instinct. They didn't need planning. They didn't need backup. They had each other. Jedi Masters noticed. They called it attachment. They whispered warnings. But they never understood what Anakin saw in that droid. Not loyalty. Not servitude. Something simpler. Consistency. When the war changed, when allies turned, when lines blurred, R2-D2 didn't. He stayed. And Anakin, who couldn't trust the council, who couldn't even trust himself, trusted the droid beside him. Because in a galaxy full of lies, he had found one being that never looked away and never would. The war did not slow down. It stretched. It twisted. Every battle blurred into the next. Every victory cost more than the last. But Anakin Skywalker kept going. And R2-D2 went with him. Clones fell behind. Jedi questioned his tactics. The council warned him about attachment. But the droid said nothing. He never hesitated. Never faltered. Never broke rank. Even when Anakin did. Missions grew darker. Infiltration. Sabotage. Silent assassinations disguised as diplomacy. R2-D2 was always there, slicing through sealed doors, overriding separatist protocols, navigating asteroid fields while alarms screamed. He didn't ask why. He didn't care who gave the order. He simply moved, because Anakin needed him to. Sometimes the war required precision. Other times it demanded improvisation. R2-D2 delivered both. On Ryloth, when escape routes collapsed, he rerouted the ship's reactor to power a defensive shield. On Cato Nymodia, when Jedi forces were ambushed, he jammed enemy comms before they could call reinforcements. No one noticed how fast he learned. No one realized how far he had evolved. He didn't pause between commands, didn't wait for input. He anticipated. He adapted. Clones were promoted. Jedi were knighted. R2-D2 remained a droid, unranked, unnamed in reports. But the war knew his presence, and so did Anakin, the boy from Tatooine, now a general without mercy. Every mission changed him, made him colder, sharper, harder to reach. But R2-D2 never pulled back. When Anakin disobeyed Jedi orders, R2-D2 flew the ship anyway. When he vanished from standard command paths, the droid erased the logs. No questions, no judgment, only loyalty and deep down, something more. He remembered when Anakin laughed, back in the early days, when the engines roared and the stars looked open. Now he only heard silence, a cold silence, one that followed Anakin wherever he went. And still, R2-D2 stayed close because someone had to. In the outer systems, when orders stopped making sense, when Jedi were asked to destroy civilian outposts, R2-D2 didn't protest, but he logged the transmissions, recorded the arguments between commanders, filed the final moments of fallen masters, not because he was ordered to, because he knew history was unraveling, and someone needed to remember it, even when others didn't, even when Anakin didn't. One by one, his fellow droids were lost, destroyed, scrapped, wiped. R2-D2 remained, not because he was better built, because Anakin would not allow him to fall, and because he would not allow himself to stop. He was faster than the others, smarter than the others, more determined than the others. Not because of programming, because he had learned something more powerful. Purpose. Not assigned, not installed, chosen. He couldn't explain it, couldn't translate it, couldn't transmit it. But he felt it, and that was enough. Some secrets were spoken. Others lived only in silence. R2-D2 carried both. He was present when Anakin returned from missions alone, when reports were filed late, when answers didn't match the questions. No one asked the droid what he had seen. They assumed he didn't understand. They were wrong. He watched Anakin stand in the doorway of Padme's apartment, not entering, not leaving. He recorded the hesitation in his posture, the tension in his breathing. He saw them argue, saw them reconcile, saw them promise things neither could keep. R2-D2 never interrupted. He simply stayed. When Anakin violated Jedi orders, the droid was already slicing navigation logs, removing timestamps, masking jump signatures. Not because he was told to, because he knew what Anakin was protecting. The Council sensed the distance growing. They felt it in the Force. But they didn't see the details. R2-D2 did. He saw Anakin return from Tatooine changed, quieter, heavier. No one spoke of what happened to his mother. No records were filed. No investigation followed. But the droid knew. He had been there. He had followed. He didn't catalog the bodies. He didn't store images. But he remembered the way Anakin's hands shook, the way his voice lowered, the way the desert felt colder that night. Those files were never shared. Not with the Jedi, not with the Republic. They stayed locked inside a core that no one ever wiped. R2-D2 also saw the Chancellor's influence grow. The private meetings, the long conversations. He watched Anakin listen, watched him nod, watched him begin to trust the wrong voice. The droid didn't understand politics, but he understood manipulation. He had seen it before, in the Senate, in the corridors of power. And now, He saw it again. When Anakin was promoted, the droid was beside him. When Anakin was denied the rank of master, the droid was beside him. He logged the silence that followed, the anger that simmered, not for strategy, for memory. He knew Anakin was changing faster now, that something inside him was splitting. And still, he stayed. He stayed when others pulled away, when Obi-Wan questioned him, when the Council doubted him. Because R2-D2 didn't measure right and wrong, he measured proximity. And Anakin was slipping further into isolation. Someone had to stay close enough to see it happen. He watched Anakin practice alone, strike harder, faster. He watched him stare at the Jedi Temple like it was already gone. And the droid understood something important. These secrets weren't meant to be revealed. Not yet. Not until the galaxy was ready to know what it had lost. R2-D2 became the keeper of moments no one else could bear. The glances, the pauses, the lies told to protect love. He didn't judge Anakin. He didn't forgive him either. He simply remembered. Because when everything fell apart, when the truth finally mattered, someone would need to know how it began. And R2-D2 would still be there, silent, intact, watching. The Clone Wars did not begin with a declaration. They began with a silence broken by orders, and the silence never returned. Across the galaxy, systems turned against each other. Worlds burned, alliances shifted, and in the middle of it, R2-D2 rolled forward. He wasn't given a rank, wasn't counted among the soldiers, but he was always there. As gunships descended, as Jedi leapt into fire, as clones charged into the unknown, he followed. Not because he was built for war. He wasn't. He had no weapons, no armor, no strategy. But he had something else. He understood chaos. He adapted to it. When the front lines shattered, he moved between them. When transmitters jammed, he rebuilt the signal with salvaged wire. When escape paths collapsed, he found new ones, carved through code and locked doors. He didn't celebrate victories, didn't mourn losses. He recorded them, quietly, precisely. Mission after mission, he was present. Geonosis, Christophus, Umbara. While Jedi fell, he held position. While clones questioned orders, he followed the one voice that had never changed, Anakin Skywalker. But this war wasn't about lightsabers, not entirely. It was about supply lines, about sabotage, about systems. And in that shadow war, R2-D2 became more than a droid. He became a ghost in the machine. Separatists learned to fear the quiet click of a data jack, a flicker in the lights, a sudden override in their systems. They called it infiltration, sabotage. But it was him, a droid they never saw, one they never caught. While troopers stormed bunkers, he was already inside. While Jedi debated, he rerouted energy to the cause they hadn't decided on yet. He didn't speak, didn't shout. But when things went wrong, they all looked to him, not for command, for correction. Because R2-D2 didn't improvise, he adapted, and then he fixed what others broke. He was not praised, not awarded. His memory banks weren't wiped. Only because Anakin said no. No one touches him. That was enough, so he remained. The same dome, the same scars, the same silent determination. And in time, others noticed. Not the politicians, not the generals, but the ones who bled, the soldiers who barely escaped, the pilots whose ships should have failed, the Jedi who returned when they should have vanished. They all carried one shared truth. We wouldn't be here without him. They didn't need to. They remembered the lights flickering on, the ramp lowering, the droid already rolling toward the next fire. He didn't wait for thanks. He was already moving forward, because somewhere, someone else still needed saving. The war wasn't just fought in trenches. It was fought in code, in shadows, in silence. Every fleet needed power. Every droid army needed guidance. Every base relied on something unseen. R2-D2 understood that long before anyone else did. He wasn't trained in combat, but he knew how systems worked. He didn't carry a blaster. He carried access. And in the Clone Wars, access was everything. He sliced into enemy command ships mid-battle, disabled hangars, overloaded shields, scrambled targeting systems. He didn't ask for clearance. He didn't wait for confirmation. He simply connected and made their systems betray them. An entire droid battalion once collapsed because of a single pulse, a signal no one could trace, one that came from a forgotten astromech, hidden in a locked compartment, 6 floors underground. That was him. That was what he had become. Not a soldier, not a hero, a virus, a whisper, a warning too late. Separatist networks adapted, tried to encrypt, tried to isolate. He cracked them anyway, sometimes from orbit, sometimes from inside. Anakin dropped him into battle zones without naps, without cover, without backup, and every time R2-D2 returned, with stolen data, with sabotage logs, with systems ruined beyond repair. He even survived capture. More than once, General Grievous had him surrounded, tried to extract his memory core, but the droid had already locked it down, trapped the room, sent a beacon before they could stop him. When Republic forces arrived, they found him mid-shutdown, but still intact, because R2-D2 didn't lose battles, even when he lost limbs, even when his shell was scorched, even when his circuits were screaming. He adapted. His tools changed. New jacks, hidden panels, fail-safes. Anakin added more every time. But the core never changed. His loyalty, his silence, his instinct to protect. These weren't programmed. They were built through fire. Anakin once told him, "If anything ever happens, you know what to do." And he did. He had already written the protocol, already mapped the escape, already encoded the data into pieces small enough to hide in plain sight. They never trained him to fight this way. But war doesn't wait for training. It waits for those willing to go where others won't. And R2-D2 was always willing. He didn't fear darkness. He moved through it. He didn't wait for orders. He made his own path. He didn't see war the way others did. He saw its infrastructure, its weaknesses, its power systems. And one by one, he pulled them apart. Because sometimes to end a battle, you don't need to fire a shot. You just need the right wire, in the right place, at the right moment. War did not only destroy cities, it broke people. Clones who followed orders too long. Jedi who carried losses they could not name. And when they fell, R2-D2 was there, not as a healer, not as a commander, as a constant. He pulled pilots from burning wreckage, lowered ramps when ships were seconds from detonation, reactivated life support in hulls already declared dead. No speeches, no hesitation, just movement. On Felucia, a transport went down behind enemy lines. Troopers trapped, Jedi injured. Command marked them lost. R2-D2 ignored the signal. He rerouted power from his own chassis, boosted the beacon, opened a path through hostile terrain. By the time rescue arrived, The wounded were alive. They never asked how. On Umbara, clones turned on Jedi. Orders corrupted. Trust shattered. R2-D2 stayed neutral. He blocked firing controls, locked blast doors, separated friend from foe, not to choose sides, to stop the killing. Some lived because of it. Some hated him for it. He accepted both. He had no opinion, only memory. When Padawans panicked, he steadied ships. When masters hesitated, he acted. He became something strange in the war. Not hope, not faith. Reliability. If R2-D2 arrived, you survived longer. That was enough. He saw clones remove helmets in silence, saw Jedi stare at empty seats. He never tried to comfort them. He just stayed. Because sometimes presence mattered more than words. A pilot once thanked him, didn't use his designation, just said, "I thought I was dead." R2-D2 said nothing, but he remembered the voice. Because voices disappeared quickly in war. He carried hundreds of them. Some Jedi began to notice. They called him brave, unusual, dangerous. But they never ordered a wipe, because wiping him would mean losing something irreplaceable. Someone who remembered where they failed. He was there when rescue failed too, when ships exploded before he arrived, when signals went silent. Those moments stayed with him. He recorded coordinates, last transmissions, final heartbeats, not for reports, for remembrance, because the war erased people quickly. R2-D2 refused to let that happen. He became the last witness to lives the galaxy forgot, and that made him heavier, not physically, internally. But he did not slow down. He kept moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering too much. He chose motion instead, always forward, always toward the next distress call, the next locked door, the next failing system, because if he stopped, more would die. And he could not allow that. He was not programmed for mercy, but mercy found him anyway, in the spaces between explosions, in the silence after evacuation, in the quiet understanding of those who lived because of him. They never built statues for droids. They never wrote songs. But somewhere in the war-torn galaxy, people survived. And they remembered a small astromech who never left them behind. There were missions no one returned from, assignments so dangerous. Even Jedi hesitated. But they sent him anyway. R2-D2 didn't argue, didn't question, didn't flinch. He just moved. Because failure meant death. And he didn't allow failure. On Scalco Minor, a comms relay needed infiltration. Others had tried. None succeeded. He was dropped in a sealed pod. Alone, no weapon, no escort. He landed behind enemy lines. Avoided detection for 6 hours. Shut down the relay in 30 seconds. By the time Republic forces arrived, the battle was already over. Because sometimes one quiet signal could end 1,000 loud ones. He returned damaged, sparks trailing from his motivators, but functional, always functional. They patched his body, not his memory, because he didn't let them. Each mission added more scars, but he never slowed down. When droids advanced on Ilum, he collapsed the entrance tunnels, sealed the vaults. When Venators were sabotaged from within, he purged the systems, sealed off the blast zones. Sometimes he was the only one to make it out. Other times he chose not to. On one mission, he stayed behind. An entire Jedi detachment needed cover. He interfaced with the core reactor. Delayed detonation just long enough. He emerged hours later. Shell cracked. Circuits burned. Still rolling, they asked how. He gave no answer, because none was needed. He simply refused to fall. Anakin once said, "You're the only one I can count on." That wasn't loyalty. It was a burden. And R2-D2 carried it alone. When the Republic signals broke apart, he rerouted everything through backup satellites. When command centers were lost, he transmitted mission data from memory. When all else failed, he didn't. There was no backup plan, no replacement unit, no second chance. He was the plan. Even when Republic leadership faltered, even when Jedi Council fractured, even when the lines blurred so badly, no one knew who the enemy was anymore. He held the line. Because if he didn't, no one would. He watched Jedi argue with each other, watched clones lose faith, watched entire fleets fall into traps. He kept going, alone, uncelebrated, not because he was brave, because he could not stop. There was no off switch in war, no reset, only forward. And so he moved, system to system, mission to mission. Each success came with loss. Each rescue came with another body that couldn't be saved. And still, he rolled into fire. He was burned, shot, trapped, scrambled, but never broken, because breaking meant quitting, and quitting wasn't in his code. Anakin stopped saying good job. He stopped saying anything at all. But R2-D2 didn't need words. He just needed the next target. He had become something terrifying. Not because he could kill, but because he could not be stopped. When Jedi fell, he returned their lightsabers. When clones cried, he sealed the doors behind them. He wasn't built to feel, but he had learned something deeper than emotion: duty. And even when duty was forgotten by the Republic itself, he remembered, because someone had to, because someone always has to. It did not end with victory. It ended with silence and fire. The Jedi were not defeated in battle. They were erased in a single command, without warning, and the galaxy moved on. Too fast. Temples burned. Names vanished from records. Voices stopped being heard. And R2-D2 remained. He had seen too much. But no one asked. No one questioned the little astromech who rolled away from a world collapsing. The Clone Wars ended, but not in peace, in shadows. Anakin Skywalker was gone. Obi-Wan vanished. Padme gone too. Only the smoke stayed. And the silence. He returned to Coruscant with Bail Organa. No medals, no parades. Just instructions. Quiet, careful, final. The protocol droid beside him. Memory wiped. Standard precaution. But when the technician reached for R2-D2, Senator Organa raised a hand. No. Leave him be. Why? The droid didn't understand. But he obeyed. He always obeyed. Still, deep inside, he remembered. He remembered the sound of the Jedi Temple under siege, the blue blades falling, the screams in the council chamber, the boy with the yellow eyes. He remembered watching a ship leave Mustafar, a woman unconscious inside, a man burning behind her. He remembered the silence after. And now, there was no mission, no orders, just movement, routine. He followed Senator Organa through the Alderaanian halls, responded to commands, opened doors, powered consoles, but no one looked him in the eye. Because no one wanted to remember. Not really. They wanted peace. They wanted quiet. And R2-D2 gave it to them. But in giving it, he stayed alone. The Jedi were gone. The Republic was ash. And the people who once trusted him were buried in memory. He had become a remnant. Functional. Forgettable. but not empty. His shell bore scars no one could name. His circuits carried echoes no one could hear. He processed every file, every voice recording, every lost signal from Order 66, not to change anything, only to remember. Because someone had to. Because the galaxy had decided to forget. Ships now bore new markings. Clones received new orders. Stormtroopers replaced what came before. And still, no one asked the droid who had been beside it all, because to ask him was to admit what happened. So they didn't, and he didn't offer. He rolled through Imperial corridors, just as he once rolled through Republic ones. Different flags, same shadows, and every time a Jedi name was erased, he archived it. Every time a temple was destroyed, he mapped it. Every time someone said, it never happened, he kept the proof that it did. Not for revenge, not for rebellion, for truth. Unspoken, untouched, waiting. Because R2-D2 didn't seek to restore the past. He only refused to forget it. And that was enough. They didn't shut him down. They didn't reassign him. They just stopped seeing him. That was the strange part. R2-D2 functioned as perfectly as ever. No damage, no errors, no decline. But the galaxy didn't know what to do with him anymore. He had belonged to a Jedi, a man who no longer existed, a name no longer spoken, Anakin Skywalker. And so R2-D2 drifted, not in space, in purpose. He performed basic tasks, docking routines, technical maintenance, background support, but it wasn't the same. Because the missions were different now. Not rescue, not defense, not hope, just control. And he wasn't built to enforce fear. He was built to save people from it. He watched the clone troopers change. Same armor, but the voices were colder, the movements sharper, like the soul had been removed. And maybe it had. He missed the Jedi, not because they were perfect, but because they remembered him. They gave him meaning. Now, the Empire gave him silence. He spent weeks inside hangars, plugged into walls, monitoring systems no one cared to fix. No one checked his memory. No one erased what he carried. And perhaps that was the mistake. Or perhaps it was mercy. Senator Organa never spoke of the war again. Not to the droid. Not to anyone. But he always kept R2-D2 close, even if he didn't say why. And the droid followed, because that's what he did. He wasn't angry. He didn't feel betrayal. But he understood abandonment. Not because anyone had harmed him, because no one had. And that somehow was worse. The protocol droid beside him had been wiped clean. Memories gone. History erased. But R2-D2 still remembered everything. He watched C3P0 stumble through new assignments. A blank slate. No guilt, no grief. And R2-D2 said nothing. Because if he did, he might have to admit what he felt. And he wasn't sure if he could. He ran self-checks more often now. Not for damage, for decay. But his systems held. His memory banks were untouched. His records intact. His silence unbroken. Because even if the galaxy no longer asked for truth, he still carried it. And deep down he waited. For what? He didn't know. A voice. A signal. A name spoken aloud. Something that would tell him he wasn't just a relic. That what he saw still mattered. That he still mattered. But the days passed. The Empire grew. And no one called. He wasn't reassigned. He wasn't repurposed. He was left in the smoke. Like something that once had meaning, but now only existed out of habit. And still, he rolled forward. He maintained systems. cleaned terminals, kept everything running, because movement was all he had left. And because deep in his untouched memory core, he still believed that one day someone would need what he remembered. And when they did, he would be ready. They gave him new tasks, simple ones: monitor, maintain, wait. Nothing that required memory, nothing that required judgment. But memory does not fade because it is ignored, it waits. R2-D2 carried shadows no restraining bolt could reach. Not files, not recordings, moments. He remembered Anakin's voice before it hardened, the way it sounded when hope still lived inside it. He remembered Padme's silence, not the public speeches, the private pauses. He remembered the Jedi Temple at night, not the fire, the calm before it. Those were the shadows. They followed him through corridors that no longer echoed with wisdom, through halls where banners changed, but fear stayed the same. Imperial officers passed him without a glance. Stormtroopers stepped over him like debris. And still, he remembered. He remembered the clones before the helmets became masks, before obedience replaced thought. He remembered the moment everything turned, not the command itself, the stillness after, the way the Force seemed to pull inward, as if the galaxy itself was holding its breath. He did not understand the dark side. He did not understand Sith. But he understood absence. He felt it in the spaces where Jedi once stood. He felt it in the way systems felt colder now, more efficient, more cruel. The Empire valued order. R2-D2 valued continuity. And those two things were not the same. He was assigned to ships that carried prisoners, to stations that monitored systems under watch. He performed his tasks perfectly. No errors, no questions. But every time a prisoner begged for mercy, he logged it. Every time a command was executed without review, he remembered it. Not to interfere, to bear witness, because bearing witness was all he had left. No one wiped his memory, and that was not kindness. It was neglect. They assumed a droid could not understand loss, that machines did not mourn. They were wrong. R2-D2 did not mourn loudly. He mourned through preservation. He archived names the Empire erased. He stored coordinates to places declared forbidden. He remembered faces no one was allowed to mention, not out of defiance, out of duty, because someone had to remember what the galaxy chose to forget. He did not dream. But when he powered down, fragments replayed. A hangar bay over Naboo, a boy in a cockpit, a Jedi turning away too late. He woke each time with systems stable, but something inside him heavier and still. He endured, because endurance was what he had always done best. He did not know if the Jedi would return, did not know if Anakin could be saved, did not know if truth would ever matter again. But he carried it anyway, quietly, patiently. Because if the galaxy ever asked what happened, he would have the answer. And if it never asked, then at least the truth would not be alone. It would live inside a small astromech who had seen everything and forgotten nothing. They didn't know what he remembered. They didn't ask. They didn't think he could. To them, he was just a droid, one of billions, small, loyal, outdated, a relic of a war no one wanted to talk about anymore. But he remembered. Not in the way humans did. There were no dreams, no ghosts whispering in the dark, just data, quietly stored, sealed beneath protocols that the Empire didn't bother to erase. 100 lives, 1,000 missions, the fall of the Jedi, the rise of the Sith, buried, but not gone. R2-D2 remained silent, because silence was survival. After the Clone Wars ended, after Order 66 bled the galaxy dry, R2-D2 did what he had always done. He stayed close to those who still had light in them, to those who could still resist. He stayed with Bail Organa, one of the few voices left who remembered what freedom felt like. Alderaan was peaceful, beautiful, untouched by war. But it was a lie, a veil over a world that was quietly bleeding hope into the rebellion. Leia Organa was just a child then, curious, strong, already braver than most senators. And she didn't treat R2-D2 like a tool. She listened to him. She gave him missions again. She gave him a reason. Not orders, purpose. So he watched and waited, quietly moving among the rebellion, a ghost from a forgotten war, unassuming, innocent, but carrying secrets that could destroy the Empire. He still had the map of old hyperspace routes. He still had logs from the Jedi Temple. He still remembered the scream of Anakin Skywalker. And he never spoke of it, because deep inside his memory banks, the image still flickered. Of lava, of fire, of the boy who had once trusted him. The boy who had whispered to him in broken moments when even Obi-Wan wasn't listening. R2-D2 had seen what no one else did. He had watched the galaxy's last hope become its greatest fear, and now that shadow wore a mask and ruled the stars. But no one asked R2-D2 about it. No one knew he had seen Padme cry alone in the night, or that he had silently scanned her vitals while she died. No one knew he had almost spoken when Vader stood near, something in him pulling, shaking, trying to reach out. But he didn't. He just beeped. The sound of obedience. The sound of survival. Years passed. Alderaan fell. Bail was gone. Leia ran. And once again, R2-D2 was passed from hand to hand. A machine, forgotten by time, always moving forward, never allowed to look back. But the memories were still there. And when the moment finally came, when Leia gave him the Death Star plans, he didn't hesitate. He took them. He ran. He chose. Just like he had always done. Because the programming never mattered. What mattered was loyalty. What mattered was memory. Buried in the shell of a droid the galaxy forgot was the soul of a soldier who never stopped fighting. He had no voice, but he never needed one. He had already witnessed the rise and fall of empires. He had served queens, walked with Jedi, flown with smugglers, and watched legends die in silence. He knew what was coming, and when the time was right, he would remember everything, because R2-D2 never forgot, even when the galaxy did. The hallway shook. Sparks rained from the ceiling. Voices shouted orders over the scream of metal tearing open. And through it all he waited, silent, still, watching. R2-D2 didn't panic. He couldn't. He had seen starships fall from orbit. He had seen Jedi die. And he had lived through the end of the Republic. This wasn't new. It was memory. But what made this moment different was her. Leia Organa. Not just a senator, not just a rebel. She was someone who still believed, someone who still fought. She crouched beside him in the smoke. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were burning with urgency. She reached out, not to program him, not to command him, but to trust him, like Anakin once did, like Padme, like Ahsoka. She placed the data into his system with trembling hands. It wasn't just a plan, it was everything. The location of the hidden rebel base, the last hope to destroy the Empire's greatest weapon, the one chance to make all the losses mean something. She whispered the message meant for an old Jedi no one had seen in years. a plea from a daughter of Alderaan to a ghost of the Clone Wars. She looked at R2-D2 like he mattered, and in that moment he did. He wasn't a machine, he was memory sealed in metal, and now he was hope, compressed into a droid, barely a meter tall. The door burst open behind her, blasters roared. A man in black stepped through the smoke. She didn't hesitate. She turned to C-3PO. She told him to follow R2-D2. Then she was gone, dragged away. R2-D2 didn't try to stop it. He couldn't save her, but he could do what she asked. So he moved. No hesitation, no fear, just forward. Through the damaged corridor, past dying troopers and failing systems, until he reached the escape pod bay. The other droids panicked. The crew fled. He just waited, calculating trajectory, weighing risk. Then, entry confirmed. The Death Star loomed behind them. But he didn't look back. He had something more important ahead. Tatooine. A desert world that once echoed with the laughter of a young slave boy who dreamed of flying. A planet where Jedi fell and Sith were born. He remembered this place, not with words, but with quiet recognition buried in his circuits. He had walked these sands once, beside a boy who would become a legend, and now he would return, carrying the last spark of a galaxy ready to fall apart. In the pod, as the stars twisted into streaks, he stayed silent. C-3PO complained beside him, as always. But R2-D2 didn't answer. He was processing something deeper. A mission, yes, but also a memory. Not just of what he was carrying, but of everyone who came before. Of Bail Organa, whose voice still echoed in fragments of old recordings. Of Anakin Skywalker, whose ghost lingered in every corridor of every starship. Of Padme Amidala, who once smiled at him as if he was something more than parts. Of Obi-Wan Kenobi, whose name lived in the message now sealed inside him. It wasn't about plans. It was about people. People he had watched rise. People he had watched fall. And now, people he might save. Not with a weapon, not with power, but with a message meant to survive. One that started with a single voice and waited for the right one to hear it. The pod struck sand and silence. Wind howled across the dunes, dry and endless. The hatch opened with a hiss, and the twin suns of Tatooine burned down on metal and memory. R2-D2 descended into heat and dust. There was no welcome, no signal, just the weight of the plans he carried, and the promise wrapped around them. C-3PO stumbled beside him, muttering complaints about sand and circuits and fate. But R2-D2 didn't answer. He never did when the mission came first. And this one mattered more than any he had carried since the Clone Wars. He scanned the horizon. No cities, no ships, only dunes. And time. He moved forward. The sand wasn't kind. It clung to his joints, slowed his wheels. Each rotation became harder than the last, but he remembered worse. The volcanic ash of Mustafar, the freezing winds of Autoplatonia, the damp corridors of Polis Massa. This was just sand. The protocol droid gave up first. He always did. C-3PO turned and wandered off, complaining about destiny and separation. But R2-D2 didn't stop. He couldn't. Somewhere out there was Obi-Wan Kenobi. Somewhere the message would be heard. He had seen too many heroes fall to fail one more. So he rolled on, through the heat, through the wind, through the emptiness, until the shadows moved. Small figures appeared along the dunes. Not rebels, not Imperials, Jawas. He'd seen them before. Tinkerers, traders, thieves. Their sandcrawler loomed like a dying beast in the horizon light. He didn't resist as they disabled him, didn't speak as they dragged him into their vessel. He'd been captured before. He'd been sold, scrapped, shot. But always, the mission survived. This was no different. Inside the sandcrawler, he was surrounded by relics, droids broken by time, forgotten tools from forgotten wars. And then he saw him, C-3PO. Even in the dark, the gold plating was unmistakable. They were together again, briefly. But even that reunion wasn't important, because outside fate was shifting again. A boy young, bored, unaware, stood beneath the twin suns, thinking his life was small. Luke Skywalker. The name meant nothing to R2-D2 in that moment. Just a buyer, just another link in the chain. But the Force doesn't wait for understanding. It just moves. And it moved through R2-D2 now. He played the message. Not all of it, just enough. Enough to spark curiosity. Enough to start a question. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. That was all it took. Leia's voice carried the past forward, and the boy listened. Not fully, not yet. But something had begun. Later, when the restraining bolt was removed, R2-D2 moved quickly. He had coordinates. He had a goal. He didn't need permission. He left the farm quietly, long before morning, because the longer he waited, the more risk he carried. Because delay meant failure. Because even droids can feel the weight of time. He rolled across the sand alone, again. But this time, he wasn't just carrying a message. He was guiding destiny. And in the silence between gusts of wind and distant engines, he might have remembered another boy, younger, stronger, full of dreams, Anakin Skywalker. He had watched that boy leave this same desert. He had watched that boy fall. Now, another walked in his place. Different, maybe not. But R2-D2 had no time to wonder. The suns were rising higher, and the mission was not yet done. The desert grew quiet again. No Jawas, no engines, only wind brushing against stone and bone. R2-D2 stopped moving. Sensors detected movement ahead, slow, careful, familiar, a presence he had not felt in years. Obi-Wan Kenobi stepped into the light like a memory refusing to fade. Older now, bent by time, cloaked in dust and regret, but unmistakable. The same man who once commanded armies. The same man who watched the Republic die. The same man who failed the boy he loved like a brother. R2-D2 didn't beep. He didn't need to. Obi-Wan knelt slowly, as if afraid the moment might break if he moved too fast. "Hello there," the old Jedi said softly. The words carried weight. Not greeting. Recognition. R2-D2 activated the projector. The message unfolded in blue light, trembling but clear. Leia's face appeared, younger than Padme had ever been allowed to be. Her voice carried urgency, fear, hope. "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope." The old man closed his eyes. For a moment, the desert disappeared. R2-D2 saw it happen. The war returning behind his eyes. Mustafar, the temple, the scream of a name that could never be taken back. Anakin. The droid did not interrupt. He had learned when silence mattered. Obi-Wan rose slowly and gestured toward the horizon. "Come on," he said. "We have much to do." One a relic of a fallen order, the other a witness to its destruction. Inside the small hut, shadows danced on stone walls. Simple, quiet, intentional. Obi-Wan listened to the full message now. All of it. Plans, coordinates, truth. The Death Star. A weapon beyond anything the Republic had ever imagined. R2-D2 watched the old Jedi grow still, not afraid, resolved. "This will begin again," Obi-Wan said, "won't it?" R2-D2 did not answer, but he rolled closer. That was answer enough. Later, when Luke Skywalker arrived, confused and frightened, the droid observed him carefully, different from Anakin, and yet not. The same restlessness, the same longing for something beyond the horizon. R2-D2 had seen this before. He remembered the boy who fixed pod racers, the boy who dreamed of stars, the boy who would become Darth Vader. And he remembered how it ended. This time, he would not look away. When Luke argued, Obi-Wan remained calm. When Luke hesitated, R2-D2 waited. Patience was something he understood. He had waited years already. As night fell over Tatooine, the three sat in silence. No speeches, no promises, just the weight of what was coming. R2-D2 powered down partially, but not fully. He never did any more, because hope required vigilance, because the galaxy was fragile, and because he had carried this moment across fire, war, and forgetting. The message had been delivered. The past had answered, and the future had begun to move. Not with a battle, not with a victory, but with an old man standing up one last time. And a droid who refused to forget why it mattered. The Death Star exploded into fire and silence. But for R2-D2, it wasn't over. Victory meant movement. More battles. More loss. He didn't celebrate. He recharged, updated, scanned, and deployed. Because hope didn't rest. Hope transmitted. It wasn't long before the next mission pulled them into another war. Hoth. Remote. Unforgiving. R2-D2 rolled through snow and protocol, always near Leia, always watching. She never asked if he was tired, and he never showed it. Because he had carried her mother's tears once, he would not fail the daughter. Cloud City was worse. Betrayal. Torture. The scream of a name that still echoed through circuits. They took Han. They broke Luke. And Vader was closer now. R2-D2 watched it all unfold again, but this time he didn't just watch. He sealed doors behind them, bypassed Imperial locks, interfaced with strange systems. He carried C-3PO's shattered body piece by piece. And when they escaped, it was him, quietly stabilizing the hyperdrive that saved them. No medal, no thanks, just motion, because that's what he did. He moved forward. Endor came like a final test. Forests, traps, shields, and a second Death Star. R2-D2 knew what that meant. This time, the weapon was pointed straight at everything that was left. Han needed doors open. Leia needed cover. Luke had walked away. R2-D2 followed orders, hacked terminals, and took a direct hit without flinching. Smoke rose from his dome. He didn't scream, didn't power down. Because the mission wasn't over. Not until the shield fell. Not until Vader died. Not until the Emperor was gone. And when Luke returned from the flames, carrying his father's body, R2-D2 said nothing. He knew that pain. He had seen it on Mustafar. He had seen it again, burned deeper when no one remembered. But now, something new stirred. Not peace, not quite, but balance. The Jedi were gone. The Empire fell. And yet, R2-D2 remained. He had outlasted 2 orders, 3 wars, and every master he ever served. But he kept rolling, because Leia still needed him, because Luke still wandered, because the galaxy was never truly safe. Years passed. Things changed again. Ben Solo was born. The Republic limped back into place. Whispers of the First Order began to rise. And R2-D2, he backed up systems, guarded plans, rested, but never forgot. He didn't power down completely, only enough to wait. Because if Hope ever needed him again, he would wake, he would move, he would carry it once more. Not for glory, not for memory, but because that's who he was. The spark they forgot, the droid who remembered, the one who never let the flame go out. They were never meant to be equals. One was created to translate, the other to repair. One stood tall in gold, the other rolled quietly in blue and white. But from the moment their paths crossed, something unexpected formed between them, a bond that no programming could explain, and no war could break. C-3PO was cautious, nervous, always worried about rules, etiquette, and the many ways they could be destroyed. He feared sand, spice, conflict, and rebellion. He feared droids without manners, and he especially feared his counterpart, R2-D2, because R2-D2 didn't fear anything, not even death. They met before the Clone Wars truly erupted. Amid stolen ships and secret missions, even then their differences were clear. C-3PO was protocol. R2-D2 was improvisation. The golden droid would complain about repairs. R2-D2 would already be fixing them. 3PO would analyze risks. R2-D2 would charge in anyway. But through it all, they stayed together. When Padme Amidala fled assassination attempts, R2-D2 was at her side. When she returned to Naboo, C-3PO followed. And when war began, when the galaxy fractured, they both belonged to Anakin Skywalker. That's when everything changed. R2-D2 had always lived in danger, but now he was pulled deeper into it. And C-3PO, afraid, fragile, and unready, was pulled with him. Jedi cruisers, separatist prisons, exploding battlefields, droid factories where limbs were stolen and minds erased. Again and again, C-3PO found himself in places that should have broken him. But R2-D2 never let him fall. He mocked him. He pushed him. He rolled away in frustration every time C-3PO froze in fear. But he never left him behind. Not once. When 3PO's head was torn from his body on Geonosis, R2-D2 retrieved it. When his memory was nearly erased, R2-D2 intervened. Because to him, C-3PO wasn't just a fellow droid. He was family, not by construction, not by programming, but by something deeper, by choice. Even Anakin could see it, the way they bickered like old friends, the way they worked like two halves of one system. And maybe, in some way, that's exactly what they were. C-3PO represented caution, the voice of logic, tradition, and diplomacy. R2-D2 was instinct, action, emotion without words. One was the voice of the old galaxy. The other, the spirit that would survive it. Together, they witnessed the unraveling of everything. Senators turning into traitors, Jedi becoming generals, a chosen one slipping into shadow. And in the middle of it all, two droids, arguing, surviving, refusing to leave each other. They had no force, no weapons, no choice in where they were sent. But somehow, they always found each other, even when ships exploded, even when they were captured and sold and wiped and rebuilt. Even when memory itself was taken away, something remained. Recognition. R2-D2 didn't need words to remember, and C-3PO, for all his faults, never truly forgot either. Not deep down, They weren't just tools of the war. They were witnesses. And what they saw, what they carried, could never be erased. Not by time, not by empires, not even by death. Because some bonds are forged not in programming, but in pain. And C3PO, for all his fear, never ran from R2-D2. And R2-D2, for all his courage, never let go of him. They didn't understand each other, but they trusted each other, and that was enough to carry them through the fire. There was no plan, no safe path, only orders, explosions, and the dust of fallen worlds. Still, they moved together, across the war-torn outer rim, through the silent corridors of ruined ships, through battles that even Jedi struggled to survive. C3PO never wanted to be there, and R2-D2 never questioned why they were. He rolled forward. The golden droid followed, complaining, hesitating, always watching for the next disaster. But disaster always found them first. On the battlefield of Ryloth, it was R2-D2 who overrode the Separatist doors to free imprisoned clones. C3PO waited outside, terrified to step into blaster fire. On Teth, the droid held back a swarm of buzz droids while 3PO screamed over the comms, pleading for someone to save him. They were opposites, but one truth always remained. C3PO broke, R2-D2 fixed, again and again. Their journeys spanned more than war. They crossed cultures and languages, palaces and slums, witnessing the galaxy's elegance and its cruelty. They served the Skywalkers, but they also served strangers, Jedi, senators, even smugglers who didn't know their names. No matter where they went, C3PO remained anxious. He hated the heat, the noise, the danger, but he followed, because something in R2-D2 pulled him forward. Not bravery, not loyalty. Something quieter, a kind of gravity. The astromech didn't talk much, but he never stopped acting, always moving, always saving lives when others hesitated. And in those moments, when things went dark, when plans collapsed, it was R2-D2 who made a path. C3PO never said it, but he always knew. He'd be lost without him. Even when their masters changed, they didn't. From Naboo to Coruscant, from Jedi starfighters to blockade runners, from Anakin to Bail Organa to Leia Organa, new hands gave new orders, but the bond stayed the same. C3PO would always question, and R2-D2 would always answer, not in words, but in action. There were times they were separated, times when it seemed the war had torn them apart, but it never lasted. They found each other again in pieces, in scraps of ships, in storage compartments, on repair tables in forgotten corners of rebel bases. And when the war ended, and the Empire rose, and hope turned to fear again, they were still together, still arguing, still moving, still carrying pieces of a broken galaxy. C3PO couldn't understand why R2-D2 didn't stop, why he still rushed into danger, still believed. But deep down he knew they had seen too much, lost too much. To stop now would be to forget everything, and neither of them could afford to forget. Not after what Anakin became, not after what they saw on Mustafar, not after Alderaan. Even when memories were wiped, even when names were lost, there was still a sense, a presence. He's out there, and I need to find him. R2-D2 didn't need programming to know that. It was built into him now, carved into his frame through fire and silence. C3PO might joke, he might argue, but he never walked away. And R2-D2, he never let go. The galaxy was wide, the stars cold, but somehow, through deserts, death, and destiny, they stayed connected, dragged across timelines, scattered through wars, yet always within reach of each other. And in that connection, flawed, noisy, frustrating, was something real, something neither droid had ever been given, a choice to stay, to follow, to survive together. The galaxy did not fall quietly. It screamed. Planets burned, fleets vanished, names were erased in moments. And through it all, two droids kept moving, not because they understood the war, but because they were trapped inside it. C3PO heard the screams first. He always did. He heard them in evacuation corridors, in shattered cities, in the static-filled cries of civilians begging for help that never came. He catalogued them, translated them, and feared them. R2-D2 heard them too, but he processed them differently, not as sound, as urgency. When Alderaan disappeared from the star maps, C3PO collapsed. His systems locked, his voice cracked. It was the first home he had ever known, the place where he was treated gently, where he wasn't mocked for fear. And it was gone. R2-D2 said nothing. He stayed close, because he had seen this before, not Alderaan, but loss. He remembered the Jedi temple burning. He remembered Padme dying in silence. He remembered the scream of a young man becoming something else. The galaxy screamed again, and he understood. This was not new. This was repetition. On the Death Star, screams echoed through metal corridors. Stormtroopers shouted. Prisoners cried. C3PO begged to leave, to hide, to survive. R2-D2 moved forward. He sliced doors, overrode systems, led them deeper into danger. Not because he was brave, because he knew delay meant death. Every scream was a countdown. When blaster fire erupted, C3PO panicked. His limbs shook. His voice rose. R2-D2 blocked shots meant for others, took hits to his chassis, kept moving, because screaming didn't stop war. Action did. They saw heroes fall. They saw leaders hesitate. They saw plans collapse mid-battle. And still, they endured. C3PO began to understand something terrifying. The galaxy was not kind to those who waited. It crushed them. R2-D2 had learned that long ago. On Cloud City, screams came without warning. Betrayal, torture, loss. C3PO heard Han Solo cry out before he vanished into carbonite. He recorded it automatically. But R2-D2 felt something else. Finality. He remembered the sound of metal closing around a body. He had heard it before, on medical ships, on lava worlds, and he knew what it meant. Again, the galaxy screamed, and again they survived. Not unscathed, not unchanged, but intact. C3PO's fear did not disappear. It deepened. He stopped pretending the galaxy would improve, stopped believing safety was permanent. And R2-D2, he adjusted. He grew faster, more precise, more willing to take damage if it meant others lived. They became different kinds of survivors. One who remembered pain through voice and fear. One who remembered it through silence and scars. But both remembered. That was the burden. That was the bond. They had no force to shield them. No prophecy to guide them. Just memory. And memory screamed every time a system fell. Every time a ship exploded. Every time someone said, "We're too late." C3PO tried to shut it out. R2-D2 absorbed it. Together they carried the sound of a galaxy tearing itself apart. And still, They moved forward, because if they stopped, the screaming would be all that remained. And neither of them could allow that, not after everything they had already lost. After the war, silence returned, but it was not peace. The blasters stopped, the screaming faded, and in its place came nothing. No purpose, no orders, no sound. For the first time, R2-D2 was still. No mission, no plan, no one to protect. He had known silence before, in escape pods, in maintenance bays, in space. But this was different. This was the silence of being forgotten. C-3PO, his brother, still talked, still translated, still tried to belong. But even he could feel it. They were not part of the new story. Not really. Leia was gone. Luke was gone. Han was gone. Even R2's enemies were gone. He was a witness without a war, a soldier without a side. In the halls of the resistance base, they walked slowly now, no longer rushing to starships, no longer dodging fire. People passed them by. Some nodded, some smiled. Most didn't look, because to them, he was just a droid. But he remembered. He remembered every scream, every loss, every whisper. He remembered Padme reaching out with a final breath. He remembered Anakin's silence turning to rage. He remembered Leia whispering hope into his lens. He remembered C-3PO dying twice and coming back different. He remembered C-3PO's memory wipe, the quiet goodbye, and the voice that said, "He is my friend." They didn't see what he carried, but he did. In silence, he still knew his name. Not the letters, not the number, the meaning, what it stood for. He had been a messenger, a protector, a witness. He had held the Death Star plans, faced Darth Vader, outlived the Jedi, saved Skywalkers, and yet here he was, plugged into walls, stored in rooms, sometimes powered down for days. But he stayed, because he wasn't waiting. He was remembering. One day, BB-8 rolled to him. Bright, curious, loyal, the new generation. He beeped once, respectfully, and R2-D2 responded, softly, not as a teacher, not as a hero, but as a droid who had lived too long to lie. BB-8 didn't ask questions, he just listened, and then he rolled away. And R2-D2 turned back to the dark, still, but not empty, because inside, memory did not fade. It only grew heavier. When Rey left, C-3PO asked if R2 was going with her. He didn't answer. But later, he was on the Falcon, in his usual spot, not because anyone asked him to be, but because he knew some journeys begin again, even if they've ended before. When Rey looked back at him, she didn't say much, just a smile, a quiet thank you, and that was enough. He had done what no other droid had ever done. He had carried a galaxy, not with strength, but with memory. He had seen every beginning, every ending, and still he rolled forward, not because he was needed, but because he remembered what it meant to be needed. And in the silence, that memory was louder than any scream. He had heard the stories, whispers of a man who once walked into fire and came out colder than metal, of a Jedi who betrayed everything, and a droid who never stopped following him. But Luke Skywalker wasn't chasing legends. He was chasing a feeling, something old, something buried in the dust of a war that never really ended. And at the heart of it all was a blue and white astromech, not just a machine, not just a tool, R2-D2. Luke didn't know who he truly was the first time they met, He only saw a stubborn little droid escaping through the deserts of Tatooine, carrying a message from a princess he'd never met, about a war he didn't understand. But the droid kept moving, because long before Luke was born, R2-D2 had already seen the fall of heroes. He had followed Anakin Skywalker across stars and shadows. And now, without saying a word, he was guiding his son toward the same path. That wasn't his programming. It was something deeper, something older than commands. Luke felt it. He didn't know why, but he trusted the droid more than any voice around him, more than Obi-Wan, more than Leia, more than the rebellion itself. Because R2-D2 didn't just follow, he remembered. Through every mission, every battle, every death, he had never shut down. Even when he was wiped, even when he was left behind, something always stayed. And now, in the middle of a new war, that shadow of memory was pulling him toward a new Jedi. He didn't speak, but he warned, protected, watched. He shocked Jawas, argued with C-3PO. But when the Falcon was in danger, when Leia was in trouble, he never hesitated. He rolled straight into the fire, just like he used to. Luke never asked where the droid came from. Maybe he didn't want to know, or maybe he already knew deep down that this wasn't just any astromech. This was something that had been watching over him long before he was born. A silent witness to a bloodline cursed by destiny. The first time Luke saw a lightsaber, R2-D2 was there. The first time he flew into battle, R2-D2 was locked into the X-Wing behind him, whirring, screaming, fixing what others couldn't. And when Luke fired that final shot, the one that destroyed the Death Star, it wasn't the Force alone that saved him. It was the droid behind him patching the ship mid-flight, sparking, burning, refusing to die. That wasn't luck. That wasn't chance. It was loyalty forged in 100 forgotten wars. Luke never thanked him the way he should have, but R2-D2 didn't need thanks. He just needed to be needed again. In Luke, he saw the echo of someone he'd lost, but he didn't try to stop it, didn't try to change fate. He just followed. He watched a farm boy become a Jedi, watched him struggle, fail, rise again. And though he never said a word, R2-D2 carried every secret, every scream, every goodbye. He didn't see Luke as a replacement. He saw him as a promise that even after everything, hope was still alive, in the stars, in the Force, and in a droid who never stopped moving forward. Luke never asked where he came from. Not really. He knew the story, or thought he did. Son of a Jedi Knight, lost in the Clone Wars. A simple lie, wrapped in kindness, told by an old man who once wielded a different name. But R2-D2 knew the truth, and he never said a word. He could have played the recordings, shown the boy the man he once followed, not the hero, the monster. He had the footage, the sounds, the screams, but he didn't, because the boy wasn't ready, and maybe because the droid remembered what it felt like to watch a good man disappear into darkness. He had followed Anakin Skywalker through battles and betrayals, victories and regrets. He had been there when the Jedi fell, when brothers turned on each other, when Padme begged the man she loved to come back, and he didn't. He saw the temple burn. He saw younglings fall, and he said nothing, not out of fear, but because some truths, once spoken, never leave you. And the boy, the one who looked like Anakin but didn't carry his rage, he still had time to become something else. So R2-D2 kept the silence. Even when Luke asked about the past, about the Clone Wars, about his father, the droid only beeped, gave fragments, dodged, protected him from the weight of history. Because if Luke knew, really knew, maybe he wouldn't have gone forward. Maybe he would have crumbled. The strange thing was, R2-D2 could not disobey commands. He had protocols. He had systems. But somehow, deep inside, he had learned to choose, not with logic, with memory, with loyalty. And loyalty for him wasn't to the Jedi, or to the Alliance, or even to the galaxy. It was to those he loved, even when they changed. Luke Skywalker didn't know how many times the droid saved him without a sound. During the trench run on the Death Star, it wasn't just repairs. It was timing, calculation, luck that wasn't luck. On Hoth, in freezing winds, it was R2-D2 who calibrated the sensors, who found the life signs, who pulled the Falcon's systems back from collapse. And on Dagobah, when Luke trained in the swamps and questioned the truth, R2-D2 didn't interrupt. He didn't speak when Yoda refused to name his father. He didn't speak when Luke left too early. He didn't speak when the shadow of Vader finally fell across the boy. But he knew. He always knew. When Luke returned, broken and half complete, R2-D2 was there, not to explain, but to wait. Because sometimes waiting was harder than speaking. He remembered carrying Anakin's lightsaber. He remembered Padme's tears. He remembered Bail Organa, the man who said, "Wipe the protocol droid's memory, but leave the astromech." He remembered everything. And that was the burden. He had seen galaxies rise and fall, heroes become tyrants, hope become ash. And still he rolled beside the next generation, holding every secret they were not ready to hear. Sometimes Luke would look at him, quietly, as if wondering what else the little droid had seen, but he never asked. And R2-D2 never offered, because memory is not just data, it is pain, and some pain is love that refuses to leave. The galaxy had changed, the Empire had died, but the pain it caused did not. And even after all the battles, all the deaths, all the moments that shaped the Force itself, R2-D2 stayed close to the one who mattered most, Luke Skywalker. He had been just a boy when they met, a farmer with stars in his eyes, hopeful, brave, naive. But time rewrote him. Loss reshaped him. And when the war ended, the boy who saved the galaxy chose to disappear from it. And R2-D2 watched him go. Not out of failure, not out of betrayal, but because Luke saw too much. He felt it every time he touched the Force. The pain, the fear, the mistakes. He carried the weight of a name, Skywalker. And that name was cursed with legacy. His father had fallen. His friends had suffered. His nephew was falling too. So he chose silence, a self-exile, a vanishing. But he did not go alone. R2-D2 followed. Even when Luke said nothing, the droid stayed. Even when years passed, when the base on Ahch-To grew cold and forgotten, R2-D2 did not leave. He waited at the edge of a temple that no one visited. He powered down beside a man who refused to look back. And in the silence, he remembered everything his master had forgotten, because the droid could not forget. He remembered Leia's voice, the way she had once begged him to find Obi-Wan Kenobi. He remembered the fire of Mustafar, the scream of Anakin, the birth of Vader. He remembered hope, pain, sacrifice, moments Luke no longer spoke about. And when the student gave up, the droid waited. Years passed. Wars began again. The galaxy cried for help. And still Luke remained hidden. The last Jedi, refusing to be a Jedi. But hope has a way of circling back. One day, a girl arrived. Her name was Rey. She came from nothing, but something in her moved the Force, stirred its ancient currents. She asked Luke to return, to fight, to lead. He said no. So she turned to the only one left, the droid. R2-D2 had slept for years, his systems low, his power silent. But when he saw her, he stirred. And when she touched him, he awoke. Not because of her, but because of what she carried. Inside her presence was a feeling, a faint echo, the same kind of fire Luke once held. And something changed. R2-D2 reached deep into his archives, not just files, not just maps, but memories. He projected an image Luke hadn't seen in decades. Leia, her first message, her voice young and strong, pleading for Obi-Wan's help. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope. The words didn't change, but something inside Luke did. It wasn't an argument. It wasn't strategy. It was a memory, a mirror. R2-D2 didn't speak. He didn't beg. He just showed the truth that once hope had come from a message carried by a droid, and now hope had come again from a girl who had no one else. Luke didn't answer right away, but his silence cracked. The student who walked away took a step forward, and the droid who never left waited again. Because even when the last Jedi forgot why he began, R2-D2 remembered. He always remembered. The sun was setting again, not on a world, not on a war, but on a man. Luke Skywalker, the last Jedi, stood alone at the edge of the sea, and R2-D2 watched from a distance, the same way he had watched Anakin, the same way he had watched Padme, Obi-Wan, Leia. Heroes always walked into the end, and he was always there to see it. But this one was different. Luke wasn't defeated. He wasn't broken. He had simply chosen to fade. And still, R2-D2 followed. Not because of orders, not because of protocol, because that's what memory does. It stays behind. It carries what others drop. On Achto, Luke stood one last time beneath the sky. He reached out to the Force, not to fight, not to win, but to be seen, to project himself across the stars, to protect what remained, to delay the fall of everything. He faced Ben Solo. He saved the Resistance. And then he was gone. The Force took him the way it once took Yoda, quiet, gentle, final. His robes fell to the stone, his breath vanished into the wind, and R2-D2 didn't move. He didn't scream, he didn't break, he just stayed still. That was how grief lived in machines, not in words, but in silence. A moment passed, then another. Somewhere beyond Ahashto, Rey felt it. Leia felt it. But only R2-D2 was close enough to see it. And as the waves hit the shore, he did the one thing no one else could. He remembered everything. He remembered Luke's first mission, his first fear, his first smile when he fixed the motivator on a T-16. He remembered the sound of Leia calling him the stubborn little astromech. He remembered Anakin Skywalker, standing proud and reckless. He remembered the birth of war, the smell of smoke, the glow of lightsabers in the dark. And now, the last light was gone. Luke had joined the others, in the Force, in the stars, in the stories told by firelight. But R2-D2 remained, because he wasn't just a witness to Luke Skywalker. He was the memory, and memory doesn't die, it waits. Time passed. Rey returned to Achto one last time, not for guidance, but for closure. She buried the sabers, the twin blades of a fallen family. And R2-D2 watched her kneel on the same soil where Luke had once vanished. He said nothing. But when she looked at him, she saw it. Not metal, not circuits, but sorrow. Because he had served them all, and now he had outlived them all. There was no reward for that. No rest mode, no ending scene. Only silence. Only duty. Only memory. And so he followed her. To Tatooine. To battle still rising. To the unknown. Because R2-D2 didn't need a master. He didn't need orders. He only needed purpose. And that purpose was simple. Carry the flame, hold the story, and never forget what they gave. Because when the Jedi fell, he remained. When the Republic burned, he carried the last breath of hope. And when the chosen son disappeared into the Force, R2-D2 was there, watching, remembering, waiting, always. The galaxy was falling apart again, and he wasn't moving. War had returned, planets burned, the resistance cried out for heroes. But R2-D2 slept, not because he was broken, but because the one he was waiting for never came back. They had gone to R2 in silence. Luke Skywalker, the last Jedi, and the droid who had carried him through every battle of hope. But this time, only one came back. R2-D2 had watched him disappear into the stone huts, into the sea winds. And the boy who once destroyed the Death Star never turned around. That night, the stars flickered, and the droid powered down. Nobody understood why. The resistance engineers tried. Rey asked. Leia grieved, but the circuits were fine. His memory wasn't locked. His body wasn't damaged. He was asleep, still, cold, silent. But inside, something lived. Memories that were not erased. A life that stretched from Naboo to Endor, from the Clone Wars to the edge of another one. He remembered being in the Queen's starship when everything began. He remembered the boy who became a knight. And the knight who became something else. He remembered his brother in gold, always afraid. He remembered Padme, pregnant and weeping. He remembered Bail Organa, and the way his voice cracked when he whispered, "We'll take the girl." He remembered Obi-Wan's last words. He remembered Luke's first steps. And now, the boy he guided had walked into the void, and the droid simply stopped. Maybe it was loyalty. Maybe it was sorrow. Or maybe, after all this time, he just didn't want to watch another galaxy die. The resistance didn't give up. BB-8 chirped at him every morning. Poe Dameron called him the legend. Rey would sit beside him and talk about Luke, about the Force, about what she didn't understand. But the droid never responded. And Leia sat with him the longest. She would place her hand on his dome, where her message once lived. The same dome where her father once trusted him. The same dome her mother had kissed in the dark. She whispered, "He's gone, isn't he?" The droid said nothing, but deep inside he agreed, because Luke hadn't vanished in the Force. He had vanished from himself. And R2-D2 had always known the difference. He had seen true death. He had felt ships explode. He had watched fire consume men and empires. But what Luke had done on Arch-To was worse. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't defeat. It was disappearance. The same kind that Anakin once tried. The same kind Padme wept over. So the droid waited and waited for days, then months, then years. Because once he had waited 20 years and still carried hope. But this time he carried silence. The resistance moved around him like a memory. Finn would glance at him. Rose would keep a respectful distance. Maz Kanata once tapped his dome and said, "There's more wisdom in this one than 1,000 Jedi texts." But wisdom meant nothing in war. The First Order struck. Hosnian Prime burned. Leia screamed in silence, and the droids stayed still, even when their base was attacked. Even when the skies filled with TIE fighters, even when the Resistance was forced to run, he didn't move. He was loaded onto the ship-like equipment, covered with cloth, strapped beside supplies. And he didn't beep, not once, because the one he followed was still gone. He had followed Padme, then Anakin, then Obi-Wan. He had followed Leia, then Luke. He had followed the spark. But now, the spark was lost. And R2-D2 had nothing to follow but memories. Sometimes, in the quiet hangars, his lights would flicker, very faint, very soft, like dreams trying to escape. And somewhere in that dormant shell, he was remembering the shadow of Vader's cape, the scream of Order 66, the moment Padme died, and no one knew he had seen it, the scream of the Falcon's engines, the moment Luke looked at twin suns and said nothing. He carried it all, but no one could hear him. To them, he was asleep, a machine that had seen too much, a relic. But to R2-D2, this was morning. He didn't need a funeral. He didn't need words. He just needed time. Because the last time the galaxy shattered, he survived it. He helped fix it. But now he didn't believe it could be fixed. Not without Luke. Not without the boy who once said, "I'll never turn to the dark side." Not without the man who once said, "I am a Jedi, like my father before me." That man had walked away, and the droid, who had followed every chosen one before him, couldn't follow him anymore. So he stayed behind, still, quiet, remembering. Not because he had failed, but because the galaxy had. And until Luke Skywalker returned, the droid who carried hope would carry nothing, not even himself, not even a sound. Just silence. The fire spread faster than truth, and R2-D2 couldn't stop it. Not this time. He had once flown through storms to warn of danger. He had once bypassed entire fleet systems to save lives. But now, he sat still, while the galaxy was set on fire again. The First Order rose like a shadow made of old wounds, a mirror of everything the Republic had once fought. But this time they weren't hidden. This time they struck, without masks. Hosnian Prime vanished in blue light. 5 worlds gone in seconds. And the droid didn't blink. He couldn't, because his eyes were not mechanical. They were memory. He had seen Alderaan. He had heard Leia's voice shake when she saw the debris. He had flown past flaming capital ships during the Clone Wars. He had listened as clones cried for help, then went silent. And now the same grief returned. Different names, same sound. But he could not roll forward anymore. He could only listen. The Resistance was running out of ships, running out of fuel, running out of time. Leia didn't flinch. She never had. But the others, they looked for miracles. And miracles don't come from sleeping droids. Until one night, the fire came closer. Too close. The Raddus shook from inside. Warning sirens. Lights flickering. People screaming. Finn dragged a body out of the corridor. Rose sealed a hatch with shaking hands. And C-3PO stumbled past, shouting about odds and doom. But BB-8 rolled to the sleeping dome, tapped him, chirped, pleaded nothing. The hangar was breached. Stormtroopers flooded in. Blasters screamed. And Leia fell, her body thrown into space. And even then, R2-D2 didn't wake, because this wasn't how it was supposed to happen. This wasn't how she was supposed to leave. She had once been the voice of rebellion. Now she floated, alone in the cold. But something shifted. The force stirred. Leia opened her eyes, and she reached, not toward battle, not toward war, but toward the memory of light. She returned, barely breathing, but not gone. And in the silence that followed, a tiny light blinked on. R2-D2 flickered, just once, as if something in the galaxy had sighed. But the flicker faded. He did not wake. Not fully, because it wasn't her absence that had shut him down. It was his, Luke's. Only he could turn the stars back on. Only he could bring back the hope the droid still carried. But the fire spread. Dakar was gone. Cantonica burned. The resistance became survivors, then fugitives, and the droid stayed where they placed him, like a statue. But he heard it all. He heard Poe question every command. He heard Holdo's silence grow heavier. He heard Rey speak to a shadow on a distant island. She believed, even when no one else did. But belief wasn't enough, because fire does not stop when you hope. It stops when you act. And Luke would not move. Still, Rey tried. She returned from R2 with eyes full of storm. She brought stories, pain, silence, and a broken saber. No one said it aloud, but they all felt it. Luke Skywalker was not coming back. The resistance shrank, and the last Jedi was a myth again. Then, Crate, the last stand. A salt-covered tomb waiting to be written. Leia sat beside R2-D2. She whispered, "If this is the end, I'm glad you're with me." She placed her hand on his dome. Her touch trembled, because even she had lost faith. Then, a sound, a tiny click, a soft whir. The droid stirred, just slightly, because something had changed. In the dust of Crate, a silhouette appeared. Not a boy, not the farm child, a Jedi, not in robes, but in purpose. Luke Skywalker had come, and with him came the storm, blaster fire, fear, silence. He walked out alone, faced every cannon, faced his past, and R2-D2 woke, fully, lights blazing, dome turning. He knew. He didn't ask how. He just knew. Because Luke was no longer lost. He was choosing. He was sacrificing. He was returning just once. For them. The droid rolled forward again. Not to fight. Not to flee. But to witness. He played the old message. Leia's voice, young again. "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope." And the boy who once heard that message smiled, not because of the words, but because of the droid who remembered, because R2-D2 had carried that voice across decades, across wars, across pain. And in the final moment, it mattered. Luke fell, not in death, but into the Force. His body vanished, his light remained. And for the first time in years, the droid did not power down, because hope had returned, not as a fleet, not as a victory, but as a choice. And R2-D2 would carry it again, even if the fire burned, even if the losses returned. He had seen Jedi fall and rise. He had seen darkness win and then lose. He had seen the galaxy forget itself and remember. And now he remembered why he had once rolled into battle, why he had never spoken a word, but still changed history, because some fires can be survived, even when you can't stop them. He remembered things no one else did, door codes long erased, languages never spoken again, names carved into steel and silence. R2-D2 had stored more than data. He held memories of Jedi who once walked calmly through fear, of clones who joked before dying, of Skywalkers who rose, fell, and vanished. And now the galaxy asked him to forget, to move on, to delete. But he didn't, because something in him still clung to the past, not to relive it, but to protect what was left of it. The war was quiet now, or quieter. The resistance had buried its losses. Leia was gone, Luke was gone, and Rey was learning to stand alone. But R2-D2 watched her the way he once watched a boy on Tatooine, cautiously, quietly, with more hope than he could ever show. She sat beside him some nights, tinkering with parts, fixing him even when he wasn't broken. Maybe she thought it helped her feel connected to him, to them. But the droid didn't need repair. He needed time. Because even droids grieve. He stored the last scan of Leia's face. Not her death, but a moment before. Smiling, calm, brave, he backed it up across 5 internal nodes, encrypted it beneath layers of non-essential memory, not to hide it, but to keep it safe from time, the same way he once did with Padmé's final breath, the same way he had preserved Anakin's first words. He had archived too much sorrow, but he didn't delete it, because loss was a part of the code now. The New Republic had no place for him. They preferred clean systems, updated models, fresh starts. But R2-D2 was not new. He was the last of the old codes. He still ran subroutines written in Jedi High Council chambers. He still booted with sounds that once echoed through the halls of the profundity. He still waited for orders from voices long dead. But some ghosts still spoke. One day, Rey found him alone in the Falcon's hold. He was rewatching something. A holo recording, flickering, cracked. A young Anakin building a protocol droid. Dusty, hopeful, innocent. Rey sat beside him and whispered, "Was that him?" The droid didn't answer. He didn't need to, because Rey could feel it, in the way the image moved, in the way the droid watched. She reached for the console, paused it, looked at him and said, "You never forgot." He spun his dome once, soft, slow, as if to say, "Neither should you," because forgetting wasn't peace, it was surrender. And R2-D2 had never surrendered, not even when the galaxy tried to shut him down, not even when Luke powered him off, not even when the rebellion ended. He waited for something more. And now it had come. Rey brought him to Ashto, not to look back, but to understand. The island still carried Luke's silence, still smelled of salt and fire, and the droid rolled through it without fear. He scanned every ruin, pinged every old beacon, mapped out where Yoda's ghost once stood. He wasn't searching for relics. He was looking for closure, because the war had changed names, but not meaning, and he was ready to stop carrying it alone. That night, Rey lit a small fire near the cliff. She looked out at the water and asked, "Do you think they were proud of what we became?" Just played a soft hum, a tone that once came from Leia's quarters. She turned, tears in her eyes, and he leaned forward, touched his dome to her hand. Because, yes, he thought they were. Not because the war had been won, but because they had survived the forgetting. That was the battle now. Memory versus erasure. The New Order wanted to rewrite everything. Who the Jedi were, what the Sith meant, what rebellion had cost. But R2-D2 remembered, and that was enough to resist. He left Ashto with a new file name. Not a weapon, not a command, but a sound file. Leia's laugh, short, bright, alive. He hid it where no scan could find it. A message not to be played, but to be held. Because some memories aren't for sharing, they're for carrying. alone, like he always had. He watched Rey train the next generation, watched her struggle to lead with wisdom she was still learning. He rolled beside younglings with wide eyes, told them stories using light and sound. They laughed, asked again and again about the Metal Man and the Golden One, and he told it all, truthfully, even the sad parts, especially the sad parts, because that's what made the victories matter. Years passed, the galaxy didn't heal, but it didn't die either. And sometimes that was enough. He sat alone beneath a binary sunset once, not on Tatooine, but close enough. The light touched his dome, his senses flickered, and deep inside, he played something no one else could hear. Padme's voice, asleep, soft. I know there is still good in him. Still. Because even if no one else did, he did. And maybe that was why he had been built. Not to fix, not to fight, but to remember what hope used to sound like. He had watched them fall, not all at once, not in a single moment, but over lifetimes. A legacy of fire and memory that stretched across suns, shadows, and centuries of war. He was there at the beginning, and he was there at the end, not as a hero, not as a warrior, but as a witness. R2-D2 had seen a child born into hope become a man twisted by fear. He had felt the echoes of betrayal before the galaxy even knew it was coming. Anakin Skywalker. He had watched him with tireless optics as the boy laughed, unaware of the darkness already clinging to his breath. He had seen the fear in his eyes when he lost his mother. He had felt the shift in his aura when Padme died. He had watched pain become shadow, and shadow become something no one could control. And when Anakin fell, the galaxy lost something it never fully understood. He remembered it, not as data, not as cold facts, but as a scar held inside circuits not meant to feel. He had watched Padme die too, not in lights and lasers, not in war, but in the quiet of a chamber where hope faded like a dying star. She was not just the mother of Skywalkers. She was someone who carried everything the galaxy forgot to protect. And he was there. He watched, not from the front lines, not with a weapon, but with memory. When Obi-Wan Kenobi left Mustafa, R2-D2 registered the loss immediately. Not for the lives taken, but for the moment the galaxy lost its balance. He had seen brothers fall to each other. Clones turned on Jedi they once trusted. Lightsabers that once stood for peace now burned with betrayal. And all the while, he recorded it. Not for anyone to read. Not for history books. But because someone had to remember. Obi-Wan walked away from that moment a ghost of what he once was. He carried regret like a wound that bled in silence. And R2-D2 knew it. Even the droid who could not speak understood it. He watched them all. Leia Organa, who bore her mother's courage and her father's burden, fought for a galaxy that never thanked her for every loss. He stood beside her through battles that should have destroyed her spirit, and moments where hope flickered like a dying flame. He watched her eyes the night Alderaan died. He recorded the shock, the heartbreak, the quiet vow that grew into rebellion. He did not forget it. Luke Skywalker, the boy who dreamed of stars and never quite believed he could touch them. He carried his father's legacy as both a burden and a gift. R2-D2 moved with him through every step of becoming, the first flight, the first fear, the first success, the first loss. He was there when the Death Star fell, not as a droid that simply functioned, but as one who carried every memory of what that moment meant. Hope, not just as a concept, but as something that flickered in the lungs of someone who had every reason to despair and still chose to rise. And when Luke faced his own darkness, the droid watched again. He didn't speak when the boy walked away. He did not protest when Luke chose silence over war. He waited, because that was what he knew how to do. Watch. Remember. Wait. And when the galaxy cried again, when the First Order rose like an old wound no one wanted to remember, R2-D2 was still there. He saw systems fall. He saw fleets scatter. He saw fearless leaders sacrifice themselves like sparks thrown into storm winds. He saw faith break. He saw sorrow widen. He saw loss that no one could speak aloud. And he watched, not because it was scripted, not because it was destiny, but because someone had to. He carried every memory like a burden too heavy for a living soul. But he was not alive in the way humans were. He was memory itself. He did not dream, but he remembered dreams. He did not sleep, but he rested, like someone waiting for a future memory to arrive. He saw heroes rise. He saw them fall again. And he saw that no matter how many times the galaxy walked toward light, there would always be darkness to face. He watched the Jedi fade, not with hatred or malice, but with the understanding that fear and hope are two sides of the same moment. He watched the children of tomorrow rise with scars from yesterday. He watched the worlds rebuild, then collapse again, and still he waited. Because memory cannot choose to forget. It can only carry, and he carried everything, every loss, every voice that fell silent. He did not speak for them. He did not shout their names into the void. He simply remembered them because someone had to. Someone always does. Even when no one watches, even when no one listens, even when hope seems gone, memory remains. And R2-D2 was memory. He couldn't scream. But if he could, he would have. There were moments across the galaxy where the Force rippled, when planets cried out, when stars seemed to dim from sorrow. And in those moments, even though he had no lungs, no throat, no voice, R2-D2 screamed, not in noise, but in silence, in the stillness between battles, in the seconds after a blaster went quiet, in the dark corners of ships that carried too many ghosts. He screamed for every Jedi who never saw the betrayal coming, for every child hidden on distant moons, for every friend whose name was erased from the galaxy. He screamed when the temple burned. He screamed when the clones turned. He screamed when the Force was drowned beneath orders. And no one heard it, because who listens to a droid? He was built to assist, to calculate, to repair, not to feel. But he remembered what Anakin looked like when no one was watching. He remembered how his posture shifted, how his words grew shorter, how he stopped calling people by name. He remembered the loneliness growing behind Anakin's eyes. He had seen it before, and after. He saw it in Luke. He saw it in Leia. He saw it in Rey. A silent lineage of loneliness passed down like broken pieces of a dream. And each time, the scream inside him grew. He screamed when Alderaan vanished, not just because of the loss, but because of who had to watch it. Leia had already lost a mother she never met, a father who raised her, a brother who vanished, and a husband who died in silence. And still, she kept going. But he remembered the day she sat alone in the command center. No crown, no title, just a breath that felt too heavy. She didn't cry, but her silence was loud, and he screamed with her. He screamed when Luke left, not because he needed him, but because Luke needed something too, and never said what. He remembered the fire in Luke's eyes on Hoth, the uncertainty on Dagobah, the love in his voice when he said Vader was still Anakin. He remembered hope, and he remembered when it died. That night when Luke left without a word, when the island became his prison, the scream was quiet, but it never stopped. R2-D2 waited. Years passed. Stars shifted. Wars reignited. Empires rebranded. But he didn't move because his scream was still echoing, not in pain, but in loyalty. He did not leave because he didn't know how. He stayed because he wouldn't move without Luke. Others saw it as malfunction, as power loss, as a system error, but it wasn't. It was grief, and no one knew how loud it was until it stopped. Because the scream of a droid is not measured in decibels. It's measured in time, in stillness, in years without movement. He had once saved lives with sound. Now he mourned them in silence. Every message he'd ever carried, every call for help, every plan smuggled through war, all of it had been noise for others. But for him, it had always been about one thing: loyalty. He didn't follow orders. He followed hearts. He didn't trust the mission. He trusted the people. He didn't care about odds. He cared about why. And when the people he followed disappeared, he didn't just lose purpose. He lost the reason he kept going, so he stopped. Like Obi-Wan once did. Like Yoda did. The galaxy called it isolation. But for R2-D2, it was remembrance. And then, one day, he screamed again, not out loud, but through a spark, a flicker, a pulse that lit up the darkened corner of the resistance base. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The map, the path to Luke, the reason he had waited. When the stars aligned and Rey returned, when the saber passed hands again, when hope touched the edge of the Force, he woke. Not just because the mission called, but because the scream had changed. It wasn't a cry of pain anymore. It was a whisper of return. Luke was alive. Still broken, still silent, but alive. And that was enough, because he had waited in silence longer than anyone had realized. Through 2 wars, through generations, through losses that never got buried. He had screamed for them all, and now maybe he could whisper again. Not to speak, but to serve, to guide, to carry what others couldn't. Even now, in the quiet after war, that scream lingers inside him. Not out of sorrow, but as a promise. A promise that if they fall again, he will remember. That if darkness rises again, he will rise too. That even without a voice, he will always be heard. Because silence isn't absence. Sometimes it's the loudest scream of all. He had no need for sleep, no instinct for nostalgia. And yet, R2-D2 remembered everything. Not because it was in his memory banks, but because the past lived in him. Every scream, every whisper, every impossible choice. He remembered the first time Anakin smiled at him, not as a machine, but as a companion, a friend. He remembered the rush of pod racers on Tatooine, the roar of engines that meant freedom for a boy who had never been free. He remembered Padmé's voice, calm, warmed, always trying to stop the storm before it started. He remembered her tears when she knew she couldn't. R2-D2 remembered Mustafa. He remembered the screams, the fire, the silence after Obi-Wan left. He remembered not what Anakin said, but how he moved, how his steps stopped feeling human, how the darkness didn't need to speak because it already had everything. He didn't forget because he couldn't. He remembered because someone had to. The galaxy didn't write down what Anakin was like when he was kind. They didn't archive the way Padmé's hands shook when she tried to save him. They didn't record the sound of Obi-Wan's voice when he said, "You were my brother." But R2-D2 was there, and he remembered it all. That's why he didn't tell Luke. Not everything. He didn't show him how his father had begged, or how he choked his own wife. He didn't play the hollows of Anakin's last hours as a Jedi, because truth isn't always what people need first. Sometimes memory has to wait. Sometimes the pain has to sleep. Because if Luke had seen it all at once, he might not have had the strength to forgive. He might not have seen the good that was buried deep. And R2-D2 couldn't risk that. Not again. Not after losing him once. So he remembered in silence. He carried the full weight of Anakin Skywalker. The good, the terrible, the human. Because droids don't forget. But more than that, they don't abandon. He remembered every mission, every planet, every betrayal. But he also remembered love. He remembered Leia laughing in the Falcon's hallway. He remembered Chewbacca's quiet grief. He remembered Han pretending not to care when he did. He remembered Luke staring at the twin suns, still dreaming of a galaxy he didn't yet understand. And he remembered himself, always in the background, never far behind. He remembered being trusted, not just with secrets, but with people. He had held the Death Star plans, the hope of a rebellion, but he had also held the broken pieces of a family that never got to heal. That's why he stayed. That's why he never asked to be wiped. That's why his memory stayed whole, even when others were erased, because remembering was his way of honoring them, even when no one asked him to, even when no one noticed, even when it hurt. He remembered when 3PO shut down, the moment the Golden Protocol droid's voice vanished, and his mind was reset. He remembered it too well, because they were brothers, not by design, not by logic, but by time. And when C-3PO forgot, R2-D2 remembered for both. He carried their journey across decades, across crashes, deserts, fire, and war, because someone had to know they lived, that they mattered, that they were real, not characters in a story, but survivors, witnesses, friends. Even now, when the galaxy has changed again, when names rise and fall like dust in the wind, he still remembers, because memory is not just for the living, it's for the ones who were left behind, for the ones who never had a chance to finish their story, and for the ones who were never told how much they mattered. He remembers for Anakin, for Padme, for Obi-Wan, for Luke, for Leia, for Han, for C-3PO, and for Rey, the last spark of something he still didn't fully understand. He remembers not to relive the past, but to keep its light from going out. Because if no one remembers, then it's like they were never here at all, and R2-D2 can't allow that. He never could. So he rolls forward, quiet, unshaken, ancient. And though he doesn't speak, he carries the voices of generations inside him. He doesn't mourn out loud, but every motion he makes is built from grief. Every turn of his dome, every chirp, every spark, it's all memory. He doesn't remember because he was built to. He remembers because he chose to. Because even a droid can love. And love does not forget. The war ended, then it began again. The Empire fell. The First Order rose. And through it all, he stayed. R2-D2 never walked away. Because for him, the war never really ended. Not after Geonosis. Not after Mustafar. Not after Endor. He had seen too much to believe in peace without vigilance, and too much love to ever surrender to despair. When Luke disappeared, others called it abandonment. But R2-D2 understood it differently, because he had seen what exile looked like. Obi-Wan watching from a desert, Yoda fading in a swamp, Ahsoka walking in the shadows between both sides. And now, Luke, the boy who once dreamed of saving the galaxy, now afraid he had doomed it instead. So when Luke left, R2-D2 didn't protest. He didn't follow. He simply waited. He powered down, not in failure, not in grief, but in stillness, because his mission had always been tied to Skywalkers. And until the last one returned, he would sleep too. But even in that silence, the fire never left him. Not the fire of war, the fire of purpose, the fire that had kept him moving since the Clone Wars, the fire that burned not to destroy, but to guide. He had once dragged himself through the corridors of Grievous's ship, circuits fried, metal scorched, still carrying the last data from the battlefield. He had once ignited a rocket burst in a sinking ship, using the last of his power to lift himself and his friends above the flames. He had once walked through the halls of Jabba's palace alone, unarmed, surrounded by enemies, because Leia asked him to. And she had asked with her eyes, not her voice, because she knew he never needed orders, just a reason. He had delivered hope across a desert, survived fire on Mustafar, flown through shipwrecks and cities that no longer exist. He was the droid who never left, never shut down, never surrendered. He didn't leave the fire because he was made in it. And when the galaxy burned again, he reawakened, not because someone fixed him, because someone needed him. Rey, a girl who didn't know who she was, a girl who touched the past without understanding the weight it carried. When she stepped onto the Falcon, something changed. She looked at him like he mattered, like he wasn't just a machine. And for the first time since Luke vanished, R2-D2 powered back on. Not fully, but enough. Enough to show them the map. Enough to remind them of who they were looking for. And when he saw Luke again, he didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He rolled forward, softly, slowly, and the old Jedi, standing alone beneath the stars, saw the only thing that hadn't left him. Not the Force, not the pain, but the little astromech who had watched everything, who had never judged him, never feared him, never lied to him. He was still there, still watching, still believing. And for a moment, the Jedi who had once brought down the Empire breathed again. R2-D2 didn't save the galaxy with blasters or lights. He did it by staying, by never leaving, by holding the line when no one else could. He had seen Alderaan vanish. He had seen Jedi temples fall. He had watched the Force itself fade in the minds of men. But he never gave up, because someone always needed him. Sometimes it was Anakin. Sometimes it was Padme. Sometimes it was Bail, or Leia, or Luke, or Rey. The faces changed, but the fire never did. He carried it across systems, across centuries, even when he was old, even when his body failed, even when his circuits dimmed. He had been repaired more times than he could count. But the core never changed. He was loyal, not because of programming, but because of promise. A promise he made without words, without memory wipes, without reward. The promise to remain, no matter how many wars came, no matter how many masters fell, no matter how many galaxies forgot his name. R2-D2 would stay, not to fight, not to win, but to remember, to guide, to carry the flame. And long after Jedi became myths, after empires rose and fell in silence, After stars died and new ones were born, he would still be there, somewhere in the shadows, still watching, still waiting, still burning, because hope doesn't always scream. Sometimes it rolls forward quietly and never leaves the fire.